Hey guys, thank you so much for joining me in another video. So today we're diving into something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. If we're gonna be honest, this has been a larger topic really since the pandemic, but in 2025, things have shifted in a different way. Of course, we've seen those charts of Chanel bags that have soared in price, as well as a bunch of other brands. And of course, there was a number of justifications for this, the price increases, the pandemic, brands wanting to elevate their prices, inflation, all of that. I think what's interesting in 2025 is how with these creative director changes, these brands repositioning themselves, as well as how global politics are reshaping how consumers are looking at luxury and how consumers are choosing to shop for luxury. And I wanted to look at this through a few different brands that have been in the spotlight recently because pricing inconsistencies, let's just get into it. So one most recent example that I've seen, but I think we've seen this happen with a multitude of new creative director changes. When a brand changes their creative side, they also change their pricing or they elevate their pricing. Brand I think of most recently is Versace Moda Operandi, which does these trunk shows where you can pre-order, pay half now, half later. Very convenient kind of way to get ahead with some of these trends. But it was noticeable with Versace how much the prices jumped. One of the clearest examples to me just when looking at bags was the bucket bag. Now this is a very like vintage 80s inspired look and collection and potentially pieces you could find at a thrift store, mixed and matched. But this bag was going for 3,100 USD, and that really stood out to me. Again, I'm not someone who shops Versace, but in my early 20s, I had a couple bags. When I think about Versace's probably most popular bags like the La Medusa bag, as well as I think they've really pushed this 95 style. These bags typically hover over the 2K. Of course, these are bags you typically can find in the sale, but their regular editions are typically at around the 2K price point. But this new style, this bucket bag, is 3,100 USD. Maybe the materials are more premium. I'm not 100% sure of that, and I think it's fair to also critique how Versace use like plastic hardware. Again, it's not one of these brands that use like really high quality materials. But then again, going back to Versace is a brand that typically goes in the sales, and I also think consumers know that under the new creative director Dario Vitale. Of course, Versace is now being acquired by Prada Group. I don't know if consumers were fully convinced by this, and of course things could change with the Prada acquisition. It could very well be like Prada wanting to acquire this brand, turn it into another Miu Miu. Of course, Miu Miu has been the success story at Prada Group, but I also can't help but think about how when Prada acquired other brands, be it Jill Sander, Helmut Lang, and what happened to those brands. But if they can turn it into Miu Miu, maybe it's going to be another success story. Miu Miu is one of these brands that has done very, very well and have definitely elevated their prices, which leads me to my next point. Miu Miu has been under fire recently. Multiple creators on TikTok, including Wisdom K, which is a very prominent fashion creator, had these viral videos showing the quality issues, the buttons literally falling off just after he unbagged these jackets, the zippers breaking. Another creator had a terrible quality experience with her fleece jacket, and as well as a poor customer service experience. Again, Miu Miu, honestly, every time I look at their prices, I am quite shocked. I know Miu Miu has typically appealed to a younger demographic. Maybe the brand in the past has not had to feel the urge to spotlight their quality, but again, we're in this era of social media where more people are posting about issues around quality. This has kind of been always like my issue with Miu Miu. Like, I think the look is cool, like the way it's presented on the runway, the way celebrities and the it girls wear it, like it's cool, young it girls. I get the vibe, but like I just also wonder if maybe they're just exploiting the fact that focus is just about the trend. And this is not an issue with just Miu Miu, of course, but I think it's very interesting how this brand that has had a lot of hype on social media, like tides have turned very quickly. Another point I want to make is the hidden pricing issue and geography. There are a lot of geographic price discrepancies. Of course, we saw during the pandemic, brands raise prices and then they would say things like, oh, well, the pricing is different here, so we have to raise it there, price harmonization. But now I think with some brands, things have had to stabilize. But I think what becomes even more extreme is what you're paying for in like Europe versus what you're paying for in America. I was genuinely genuinely excited for Celine's new collection. I am still genuinely excited, and I did my full breakdown. I think it's a collection that is very strong. I couldn't help but think when I saw Style.com's post on pricing, even though it was in euros, for a second I thought, wow, okay, like the pricing here, it's not too bad, just for a second. And then I looked at the pricing, I checked the Canadian pricing, and then I checked the American pricing, and there is a substantial difference. For example, the new Celine small luggage, it's 3,600 USD retail. By the way, I think this is not an offensively priced bag for Celine in 2025. It is up there. This is a luxury priced bag, but I think for this size, I am not offended by this. And then if you factor in like taxes, depending on where you live, it could be anywhere up to like close to 4,000 USD, depending on where you live in America. I think about living in Canada. When I think about the Canadian currency, it goes for 4,600 Canadian, which is with my Ontario tax, that brings it up to 51.98 Canadian dollars. That is not out of the ordinary for Celine pricing. But I couldn't help but think when I was in Europe and looking at the pricing in Europe, this bag is going for 2,900 euros. And of course, if you think about tax refund, that brings it down to 2,550 euros. Roughly, while that bag, it's almost going for almost like 4,000 USD. If you were to buy this bag in Paris, it would be 2,550 euros or like roughly 2,700 USD if you buy that in Paris. That is not a small difference. That is like a vacation level difference. That is the difference of a round trip flight and a long weekend hotel trip. I also think as a Canadian, historically, I would go to the US to save on the tax or take advantage of lower prices due to lower taxes, but it's actually cheaper for me as a Canadian to buy Celine locally than it is to buy it in the United States. And of course, currency changes and these numbers fluctuate a little bit differently depending on the day. Maybe during the pandemic, because we were all kind of stuck at home, I think consumers are thinking differently about where they choose to buy and what they choose to buy. Of course, there's the tariff situation, which I've covered before, that is of course affecting American pricing. The fact that it is better to buy in Canada, even while paying our higher taxes in Canada, which hasn't always been the case. Like some things in Canada have been better to buy, but I've noticed like just the taxes alone. Of course, there's also the currency, which also fluctuates. I think consumers are thinking about customs, they're thinking about duties, they're thinking about tariffs and what type of products they want to buy on their next vacation. But I was also thinking about this because Lauren Sherman, she wrote an article recently on PHILO, the brand, but she also mentioned this pretty extreme price difference between shopping for PHILO in the US versus Europe when buying a suit is a substantial difference. And then you have a brand like the Loewe, which is a totally different situation. Of course, it's an American brand, but if I were to buy the Loewe, it's best for me to buy the Loewe in the United States. Europe, it's actually... it could be more expensive, but then when you consider the VAT refund, you might break even. But if you are a European, you are going to be paying more in Europe than you would pay in the United States. Generally, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but I also think about how other American brands, not just the Loewe, be it Kate or Savette, in like the realm of handbags, because of course these are still highly priced brands. And of course, I also have to say all of this is very subjective, how we value certain things, but even just looking at like a brand like Savette, there's this like chic elegance about this brand, nowhere near the price of like a Celine or any of these other like high-end luxury brands. In another way, there's a brand like Coach, which is gaining more and more momentum. It has that like fashion factor, but I don't even think this is just an American phenomenon. I was watching this Bloomberg video that came up on my feed, and they were discussing how in China, local brands like Songmont, which is a brand that does like handbags, leather goods, they're becoming even more popular with the locals. It's these kinds of indie or emerging or local brands that many locals are choosing to buy into instead of these European heritage luxury brands. Maybe it's people feeling the desire to support brands at a local level. Maybe these local brands just speak to the local styles of the time. Like I think, you know, Kate may not hit in parts of Europe, but this like Kate girl, you absolutely see this like American look. There is a theme of Americana within her fashion that hits with Americans. But even just going back to Paris, the brand that I saw in all the locals, and I'm not talking about fashion people in the Marais, I'm talking about the locals, like what I saw in almost every street corner. It wasn't Hermes, it wasn't Chanel, it wasn't Louis Vuitton when it came to the bags. I did see a surprising number of Celine bags, especially in the canvas, but it still wasn't everywhere. The brand that I saw everywhere was Pauline. Again, it's not a brand that has like spoken to me, but I do understand, like, when I look at the pricing and I looked at some of these bags, I 100% get it. And they're made in Spain. I will say it's not like touching a bag from the Row or like Hermes, but they're very nice bags. You even see that sentiment even within the locals of Paris. And of course, another alternative, of course, which is a direction I love, and I think each year it just becomes even more extreme for me. And I also think in fashion we're seeing a more extreme move towards pre-loved and vintage. I've talked about in multiple videos even how these brands are continuing to reissue and revamp styles of the past. It's no wonder more and more people want to go to the pre-loved styles because A, the quality, but B, pricing is better. And I did think it was interesting how the Row partnered with Pre-Cloth, which is this like secondhand little boutique, how they had throughout like the winter 2025 collection all of these antique like accents. I think this is how a lot more people are approaching fashion. It's not necessarily this kind of thrifted look, but it's more of this attitude of having these heirloom worthy pieces mixed in with these quality pieces. There's something about this look of these pieces. They could be mixing these little antique accents from the Row, it could be from Pauline, it could be from Cause, but this mixing in these precious, unique, vintage pieces that not everybody has. Maybe they want to be a little bit more precious with these pieces, or maybe on the flip side there is this kind of carefreeness in that these pieces already have signs of age. These pieces have a beautiful patina. And of course, these kinds of antique pieces, they could be like ultra rare and expensive, but these are also things that could be borrowed from your mother, your grandmother. I think consumers are really thinking not just the price of luxury or like necessarily the brand or like the look of the brand or like brand identifiers, but people are thinking more about like the value. Of course, there's been more spotlight on like the pricing. More consumers are thinking, what value does a piece like this have for me? And also, what is their own connection to a luxury good? And going back to, you could spend $4,000 on a Celine bag locally, or would you rather take that $4,000, put some of it towards a vacation and the rest of it, maybe you buy the Celine bag, maybe you buy a Pauline bag, maybe you buy a vintage treasure, but at least it creates like more of a connection to the piece rather than just the way people were buying things 5 years ago during the pandemic, where people were buying things online and there was this like sense of FOMO because of price increases or this like perceived scarcity. I think consumers are being a lot more considerate and they're looking for pieces that have value but also connection.